I've got a riddle for you. How can the UK have a constitution if it doesn't have a constitution? This doesn't make sense, right? Well, in this video I'm going to break down what we mean when we talk about a constitution, how constitution might not actually mean what you think it does, and then explain how, despite not having a book called The Constitution, we can still talk about a British constitution. Wow, I've said the word constitution quite a lot in the first 15 seconds here. When you hear the word constitution, what do you think of? Chances are you're thinking of a super important political and legal document. Maybe this document is old, maybe it's written on vellum, maybe it has the quality of a sacred holy text, almost like the Bible, unchanging, eternal. Where I'm from, Ireland, which you can probably tell from the accent, when we hear the word constitution, we do think of a book. And yes, this book contains the most fundamental important laws in the state. So how do we ensure that this law is the most important and is the most fundamental? Well, let's think of a legal system as like a pyramid, with the most important law at the top. And we can call this law constitutional law. The Constitution creates the legislature, the body that is empowered to create law under the Constitution. In Ireland, this is what we call the Oireachtas. In the UK, we call this Parliament. Underneath this legislation level, we have common law. You can think of common law essentially as judge-made law. Why is common law underneath legislation in this pyramid? Well, because if there is a clash between common law and legislation, legislation prevails. What this means is that courts will apply the rule contained in legislation and not the previous rule that was contained in the common law. So let's apply this principle then to the next level up. What if there's a clash between what the Constitution says and what legislation says? Well, exactly the same thing happens and the Constitution will prevail. This means therefore that the legislation will be what we call unconstitutional. Not only that, but it is considered not to be law at all. Why? Because the Parliament never had the power to make that unconstitutional law in the first place. And all of this then raises the question as to who decides whether the legislation is unconstitutional or not. It's the courts, of course. So under this understanding then, a constitution is a document containing all the most important laws of a state that are considered to be superior to all others. In order to ensure that constitutional laws are superior to other sources of laws, such as legislation, courts need to be empowered to find legislation unconstitutional. But is this really the only way to think about what a constitution is? Well, it's all well and good for me saying here that some laws are more important than others. But this doesn't actually tell us anything about why or what types of law are more important. So perhaps another way to look at the question of what a constitution is to look at what a constitution actually does. If we analyse constitutions around the world, we will see that most constitutions tend to do similar things. Very often, constitutions will seek to give a state its identity or declare that there are certain principles and values that the state seeks to aspire to. So if we take, for example, the Constitution of South Africa that was enacted after the end of apartheid. It states that the Republic of South Africa is one sovereign democratic state founded on the following values. And then it lists a series of values which it espouses and vindicates. So that's one thing a constitution will do. It will espouse the values that it seeks to defend and vindicate. Secondly, a constitution will very often allocate and limit state power. So take, for example, our above explanation of the power of the legislature to make laws. Well, where did it get this power from? Very often the Constitution will expressly give it this power. Likewise, the power of the courts to interpret and apply the Constitution. Where does this power come from? Again, the Constitution will give the courts this power. Most constitutions tend to follow what's called the separation of powers. And we will have a video later on in this series that goes into the separation of powers in greater detail. But the general thinking behind the separation of powers is basically that in order to prevent abuse of power, we need to split it up. And we need to split it up between the three different branches of government: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. And as we've seen, the legislature is the body that's empowered to make the law. The executive is the body that is empowered to execute and enforce the law. And the judiciary is the body that's empowered to interpret the law and adjudicate disputes. Some constitutions will also allocate power to different regions and provinces or states. So for example, the United States is made up of 50 states. each with their own legislature, executive and judiciary. There's also the central US government in Washington, and the Constitution will set out what powers this government has and what powers the 50 states have. We call this federalism, and the opposite of this is a unitary state in which there is just one central government and nothing is off limits in terms of what this central government can do. Frequently, but not always, constitutions will also contain a list of human rights, which the branches of governments must respect. Usually, but again not always, courts will be empowered to declare legislation or government action unconstitutional if it violates these rights. And finally, constitutions will also stipulate how they can be amended. Contrary to some belief, constitutions are not like a holy religious text. They can change, and they do change all the time. They're not actually written in stone. So circling back then to the UK, if a constitution then sets out a state's identity and fundamental principles which the state espouses, if it allocates and limits power, if it regulates layers of governments, for example whether a state is federalist or not, if it sets out human rights, and if it details rules as to how to change the constitution, then we can move beyond the idea of viewing a constitution as contained solely in a single legal document called the Constitution. And so the UK can have a constitution. What we have to do is locate the laws and rules that give the UK its identity, and that do all these things, that allocate and limit state power, that regulate the layers of governments, and that set out human rights. And so in the next video then, we're going to discuss a key aspect of the UK's constitutional identity, the monarchy, the very institution that puts the kingdom into the United Kingdom.